UniverCity 2000. I'm pleased to welcome you here today for a great presentation we're going to be having from Peter Benson. Well, my experiences with youth and youth serving agencies are perhaps similar to many in this audience. Initially as a youth, when I was age 10 to 12, many decades ago, we were, my home in North Dakota, we were a foster home. And so one of my little sisters was Patty, who stayed with us a while, but then obviously was later sent back to her family. So I grew up with many youth issues. My mother was on the county welfare board. Then later, I got to experience life and youth as a parent, interesting times, to say the least, and now as a grandparent, yes, yes. All these friends used to tell me about being a grandparent, and I didn't believe a word of it. It's all true. It's really fun. Well, currently as a foundation official, I review grant applications for youth-serving agencies, and my position has become more proactive with making decisions and recommending possible courses of action. All that changed in 1997. It was a pivotal year in how I changed my entire thinking about youth, about our children, and about our adolescents. Somebody said, "You mean even foundation people can change?" Yes, we can. Well, someone asked me, "Doug, have you ever heard of the Search Institute?" This was in 1997. I said, "No, but tell me about it." Well, the rest, they say, in my personal life is history, because I began to find out more and more about the Search Institute. It's based in Minneapolis. It's founded in 1958 as a national applied research organization. And beginning in the 1990s, the Institute began focusing on the healthy development of American youth. And in the fall of 1998, I spent a wonderful couple of days in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I attended the annual conference of Healthy Communities, Healthy Youth. Usually I go to these conferences, and I'll be honest, some of the sessions not very applicable or not very interesting. Here was a conference where youth and adults were fully engaged in having fun together. It was awesome. The fourth annual conference will be in November of this year in Minneapolis, and I know several people from Muncie hope to be in attendance. Well, now after 4 years from my initial contact of hearing about the Search Institute, the asset program that Peter Benson and others have developed have become an essential part of many of the Foundation's grant programs. As a matter of fact, tomorrow a couple of us are driving to northern Indiana and working with an educational institution in the northern part of our state and trying to help them to inculcate the Search Institute principles into their curriculum. In Indiana, our base for the Search Institute is the Indiana Youth Institute based in Indianapolis. October 26th, IYI is hosting a one-day training seminar right here in Muncie for local organizations. I know the United Way and other organizations will be telling you more about it. Well, today, UniverCity 2000 is really fortunate. It's a special treat for us to have the Search Institute and Peter Benson as our keynote speaker. We've had a lot of comments and inquiries since this was announced. We had people calling from all over the state, and this morning one of the schools from Indianapolis public area calls up and, well, after he's finished in Muncie, could he stop by in the morning for just a little bit? I think that's the national renown that Peter is known both across the country and here in our community. Peter was educated at Augustana and at Yale, and his PhD is in social psychology from the University of Denver. He's taught at several colleges and universities, and at one time he was a Hoosier along with us just down the road at Earlham College in Richmond. He's authored or co-authored 9 books, and the latest of which is The Fragile Foundation, the State of Developmental Assets Across America. Peter has a passion, a deep and abiding passion in youth. And he continually asks all of us the question, how can all of us successfully engage youth in the life of our community? Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Peter Benson speaking on healthy community, healthy youth.
Thank you, Doug, for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, new and old friends at Ball State and in Muncie. I'm thrilled to be a part of this celebration with you as you continue to try to think toward the future and about possibility and about how this culture changes for the better. And our conversation for the next few minutes is going to be about possibility, the possibility of raising the healthiest of kids in America. And I'm really anxious to tell you the story of the ideas we're developing and the spread of the ideas in the United States. But ultimately, I want to leave you with a sense of your own personal power, your own personal efficacy for mattering deeply and profoundly in the lives of children and adolescents. No program ever changed a kid. No program ever changed a kid. Human relationships change young people. Human relationships. And this is becoming a non-relational culture that seeks efficient and oftentimes bureaucratic approaches to raising healthy human beings. Not until this country reawakens to the power of 200 million citizens and the dailiness of kids' lives will the needle really move. The power is here in America, but the power is dormant. It's latent. It's like a sleeping giant that has gone underground. It's been 22 years since I set foot on the campus of Ball State University when I was a faculty member at Earlham. I was also the varsity women's tennis coach. And we traveled up here one fall and got our rear ends whipped by Ball State. And it's probably good for you right now to remember that it is possible for your athletic teams to win. I know it personally, and I was impressed. The good days will come back. Well, let me begin this way. When people in America, policymakers, leaders, politicians, begin to reimagine how America can change to support the healthy development of our young, that conversation, that discourse, turns usually to economics and the terribly important issue of why this culture raises still so many kids in poverty. And the conversation moves also to naming the risks and problems that get in the way, that become obstacles to raising healthy children and adolescents. And so we develop huge initiatives in the United States around the prevention of school dropout, of alcohol use, of chemical use, of teen pregnancy. As important as those economic initiatives are, and those programmatic initiatives to reduce problem, as important as that is, I want to talk to you about a different issue. And it's the issue of the rupture in the American developmental infrastructure. A deep rupture, a deep tear in the fabric of how it is healthy human beings are raised from the get-go. A rupture in the basic processes of naming and knowing and including and engaging, affirming and supporting and connecting to the young in our midst. This, my friends, is the most age-segregated society that has ever existed in the history of human civilization. This one right now. How many adults should an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old know well, and spend time with and trust? I would guess that number is somewhere between 10 and 20 significant relationships need to be in a young person's life if they are to grow to wholeness, if they are to become centered and focused people. But do you know now how rare it is for young people in Muncie or anywhere else to have even one sustained long-term connection to an adult they are not related to? This country is organized in a way to make it harder and harder for generations to connect. Here's one reason to worry about it. How do you transmit the wisdom from one generation to a next? How do you teach the best of our culture to the neophytes of a culture? Americans now think, ooh, the answer? A program. Let's develop a curriculum and teach values to kids. Oh no. The way it really happens, and always has, is first by osmosis. It happens by embedding the young in a network of caring and principled adults. Kids have to figure out developmentally why those adults choose A rather than B. And then when you undergird that with curriculum, what a great double dose. But in America, the osmosis process is evaporating. We do the next best thing. We program and teach, and we ask our schools to do most of that, while everybody else in America is off and running and chasing other ends, oftentimes economic ends. One of the key issues about America is the loss of relational energy in young people's lives. If you ask kids now, and you could try this sometime in Muncie, ask them a question like, maybe this is a tad abstract, but to whom do you belong? If you ask the kids of your cities, to whom do you belong? My guess is they would not say, I belong to a community. They wouldn't say, I belong to a people. They wouldn't say, I belong to a tradition. They wouldn't say, I belong to a network. They'd probably say, I belong to my friends. It's my peer group that is the place where I get my support, my affirmation, my structure, my boundaries, my connection, my engagement, my sense of importance. Peer influence is important, but in this culture right now, peer influence far outweighs adult influence in the lives of our young. In the United States right now, every town and city, including Muncie, is organized in a way, either benignly or unconsciously, to interfere with the developmental infrastructure. Our towns are age-segregated. Our adults are silent. Our adults have lost the courage of voice in the presence of kids, out of fear we might offend, that we speak our own personal truth. There's a deep mistrust in America now between adults and young people. Public opinion polls show that while American citizens care a great deal about adolescents, they're suspicious of them, and they're a little worried, perhaps very worried, about actually connecting. It's a country now where the norm is civic disengagement rather than civic engagement. It's a culture where we isolate our families and over-depend on families as agents of socialization. Hey, what a dumb idea. Who ever thought that family alone is the socializer of our kids? Families are special agents of healthy development. But families must be bounded themselves in a web of community support, not isolated from community. But it's very typical in America now to isolate our families and expect them to be sole decision maker. It's a culture of turf and fragmentation, a culture where it is so hard now to connect the dots in our cities as we work in silos. It seems to me that during the first 20 years of life now in the United States, it is very common to grow up in a way where you know nobody outside of your family across a period of time, where you are unnamed and unknown in your own neighborhood, where you are unwelcome in public places, that when you're in shopping malls, somebody will look at you suspiciously. When you pass adults on the street, they divert their gaze or walk to the other side of the street. It's a culture where you will get program after program after program, but too little sustained developmental attention of people looking you in the eye and knowing that last year you were interested in the saxophone and this year you are interested in the guitar. It's so rare now for young people to have those deep connections. Recently I asked a young woman, an 8th grade student in my hometown of Minneapolis, to tell me about the most significant moments in her life now that she's 13 or 14 years old. And she thought for a moment and she said, "You know, I think the most important thing that ever happened to me happened last week when I was in the Southdale Shopping Center, south of Minneapolis. And my 4th grade teacher that I had 4 years ago, that I hadn't seen in 4 years, walked up to me and used my name." Why would a young person cite that kind of story about one of the most important things that ever happened to me was an adult choosing to know me well enough, caring enough, knowing me across time, to be able to use my name? It tells us something about where this culture is. It also tells us something about the power of connection and relationship. In fact, if Muncie wanted to become the profound asset-building city it could become, a first step is to challenge every human being in Muncie to know the names of 6 children, to know the names. Because you see, so much begins when the naming begins. See, I love the stories of people who choose to connect to kids, not just as volunteers and mentors, but who carry themselves in life as connectors. I met a gentleman recently who used to collect baseball cards. He knows a neighborhood boy, now age 8, collects baseball cards. He walked over recently, knocked on the door, and gave that kid a Willie Mays card, saying, "I know you're collecting cards. I used to do that. I wanted to share part of my collection." Sounds like a small act, doesn't it? Human development is the accumulation of small acts, of small gestures, and every human being is powerful. The problem is most Americans have forgotten their power, and we overdepend on professionals and experts now to raise our kids while we forget where the real power is. These concerns about the tear in the developmental infrastructure are not urban concerns alone. These are issues that touch American suburbs and American rural communities. I think most Americans see and feel the crumbling infrastructure, but they see it happening in bits and pieces and rarely step back to see the whole. You know, in some ways, it isn't really completely clear to me or anybody else if growing up now in the United States is riskier business than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Maybe today our lenses are sharper, but you know, in some ways it doesn't really matter, does it? Because what matters, and you know it in your own friendship circles and in your own communities, that there are too many casualties, too many close calls, too much lost potential, too many who are pushed away and forgotten. What matters is that this society is failing to provide the vibrant developmental infrastructure which communities have natural power to provide, but they need to re-energize, renew, and alter what it means to be community and what it means to be human being. Why are we in this mess? Well, if blame is to be cast, I suspect it implicates a wide range of individuals, systems, politicians, public policies. But the issue is bigger than families, it's bigger than schools, it's bigger than politics. The problem is deeper than cutbacks in funding. It's deeper than any particular short-term policy that a government may choose to develop or not develop. I do believe that the problem actually lies at the core of how this society actually functions, at the core of the American value system about who is responsible and accountable for healthy human development. In essence, my friends, what we're talking about is a cultural problem, an American cultural problem. What kind of culture is this when we think of the issue of raising healthy human beings? The average age now for the onset of depression is 14 and a half years old. 20 years ago, it was age 29 and a half. The morale of our young is going south as our economy is going north. What kind of culture is this? 3 years ago, American cable television came to the island of Fiji. In the last 3 years, the rates of anorexia and bulimia among young girls in Fiji have quadrupled. What kind of culture is this? 2/3 of all middle school and high school students in the United States now engage in at least one pattern of health compromising behavior. What kind of society is this? The starting salary for college graduates as of last spring, the class of 2000, go like this: $60,000 on the average if you go into the high-tech business, $45,000 to start if you move into business and accounting and finance, $28,000 if you become a teacher. What kind of culture is this? In the last 30 years within my field of psychology, there have been 50,000 studies focusing on the symptoms or problems of anxiety and depression, only 50 studies focusing on joy. What kind of culture is this, in that case, which continues to examine things through a negative lens and so rarely examines things through the lens of possibility? Our topic this morning, this afternoon, whatever time it is, I've been talking about this actually since this morning, it seems, is about the repair of the American developmental infrastructure, about the possibility, both of the vision of rebuilding the developmental infrastructure and the real power of what can happen when communities begin to seek to be asset-building places. I began this work in transformation, in the transformation of community, about 10 years ago. I've been at Search Institute 22 years, right after I left Earlham College, in fact. But began this work 10 years ago. And we have a team of about 60 people, social scientists, writers, educators, trainers, and consultants, as we do applied scientific research, that is, research designed to matter. Knowledge designed to enter lives and systems to provoke change. It's an exciting kind of science. It's different than basic science. It's a science directly applicable to the lives of people. So in this decade, I began, first of all, by positing a language called developmental assets. 40 building blocks of positive human development that every American kid needs and deserves, focusing on the good things that need to be promoted. I'm going to talk to you in a moment about why it is so powerful to frame things in a language system of the good stuff to be promoted rather than continuing to dwell in language systems about bad things to be stopped. They are very different processes running on very different energy systems. A second concept that my colleagues and I are birthing now is called asset building community. The nature, the feel, the dynamics of towns and cities that put it all together, connect the dots, create a large citywide vision, and mobilize their human beings, their schools, their families, their neighborhoods, their congregations, their employers to unite in building these 40 developmental assets in our young. It's a really exciting time that forces us to integrate anthropology, sociology, education, social work, a number of fields into a whole fabric. Because you know, as many of you deeply know, even in our universities, we silo knowledge systems. We divorce knowledge systems from each other. So one of the things I love about my work now is the challenge to be an interdisciplinary thinker. In fact, the reason I went to Earlham College 25 years ago was that they had started a new major called Human Development and Social Relations. I was asked to chair it, and it integrated 5 fields: ethics, biology, anthropology, sociology, and psychology, into a whole fabric around how human development happens and how societies can either enable or inhibit the healthy growth of people. So I guess I have always had an instinct for interdisciplinary issues that seems to be deeply a part of my life. So I want to talk to you a bit about the science of developmental assets, positive building blocks, the science and practice of asset building community. I want to talk about these for a few moments, and then we'll move, I hope, to some dialogue with each other about all of this. Let me tell you a little bit about how to fit my work and our work at Search Institute into a conceptual landscape. Here's one way. If a city is going to raise healthy human beings, it needs 4 healthy infrastructures. First of all, it needs a healthy economic infrastructure. That is, a place that worries about affordable housing, fair wage, good jobs. That economic infrastructure does matter, doesn't it, for the nurture of wholeness in our young. There also needs to be a service infrastructure, a healthy service infrastructure where we have compassionate and effective systems for helping kids and families who fall off the path, to intervene early and to intervene well. And then towns and cities also need a program infrastructure. They need a system of safe places to be, particularly in the gap periods between the end of school and when parents arrive home, a program infrastructure with caring people, competency building curricula, safe environments. But when you hear politicians talk, or any civic leader talk about change, so often they'll talk about the economic infrastructure, the service infrastructure, the program infrastructure. Too rarely do we talk about the 4th infrastructure. And that's the one I'm here to talk with you about today, the human development infrastructure. The natural and inherent capacity of communities of people to build developmental strengths in kids by knowing them, naming them, engaging them. In the little town of Bemidji, Minnesota, not much bigger than Muncie, adolescents have done a study in the last few years to discover what percentage of adults divert the gaze from kids when they pass them on the streets. In towns like Bemidji, about 80% of the time a middle school kid passes adults he or she doesn't know. Adults give a nonverbal dissing sign by diverting their gaze. One of the things that's happening in Bemidji as a part of their asset building movement is that 500 senior citizens who gather every Thursday noon for lunch were challenging themselves about what can we do as 500 senior citizens to be asset builders in kids' lives, because we have such a hard time in Bemidji actually connecting to kids. And somebody said, I got an idea. Let's look at kids in the eye and smile at them when we see them in Bemidji. Well, for the first year that started to happen, adolescents were like, whoa, what is happening? This is very strange. Is my fly open? Why are people laughing at me? See, why would kids even detect the act of adults looking at them in the eye? Why would it even register consciously? That tells you something about where this culture is. That ought to be such a normal process of growing up. It ought to happen so many times every day that people at least nonverbally connect you that you don't even name it anymore. It's part of the normative fabric of one's community. But Bemidji is becoming a place now where that small gesture matters. It's one of 1,000 small gestures that matter that are evaporating in the American developmental infrastructure. The human developmental infrastructure has to do with the rhythms and patterns of relational energy in communities. It has to do with how communities support, affirm, know, engage, connect, speak to, and include the young of a city. And the developmental infrastructure is not the work of professionals. It's the work of the people. It's the natural work of the people. And one could make the case that the burgeoning business of professionalizing the raising of kids is about the fact that most citizens have now abdicated their connection points to the kids of a city. At least that's a thesis that I am playing with. There is mounting evidence that the human developmental infrastructure is ruptured. In the last 5 years, my team and I at Search Institute have studied 1 million middle school and high school kids in the United States. It is the largest capture, picture-taking of youth development ever done in America. This is really a composite of all of the middle school and high school kids in about 1,200 towns and cities in the United States. Let me just quickly tell you what we discover in this national picture-taking of kids. Here are 3 support assets that every kid ought to have. Intergenerational community, that is knowing 3 or more adults for longer than a year's time. Caring neighborhood, where a young person believes there are people in one's immediate surroundings who know their name and care about them. And caring school, the sense, the perception that this place I go to called school is an institution that actually cares about me. In this national assessment, here's what we actually learned, that only 41% of America's kids have the intergenerational asset, only 40% caring neighborhood asset, and only 25% the caring school climate asset. 41, 40, 25. Those very important forms of support are now minority developmental strengths in America. A minority of kids possessing them. I'm not saying that these 3 alone, intergenerational community, caring neighborhood, caring school, is what raises a healthy being. I'm telling you that's 3 of at least 40 building blocks of development that when they come together in a whole begin to really shape a life. The developmental infrastructure is collapsing. It's unclear why that's happening. Age segregation. I do think there is socialization inconsistency in the United States. What's the chance that the same messages are heard in multiple places by a young person? What's the chance that school, neighborhood, congregation, Burger King ever is on the same page, singing the same song about what a community believes to be in bounds and what a community believes to be out of bounds? It's a pretty slim possibility. But I can tell you, friends of Muncie, that if you actually polled the people of Muncie, you would find that 99% of the people who live here think that school success is in bounds, caring for others is in bounds, serving others is in bounds, early chemical use is out of bounds, the violent resolution of conflict is out of bounds. Why is it then that in Muncie or anywhere else it is fairly rare for kids to hear a unified voice about in bounds and out of bounds? Why is it we are so afraid to find our voice? The voice matters in the enterprise of human development. This is also a culture of the over-professionalization of the work of raising healthy human beings. One of my good colleagues, John McKnight at Northwestern, has written a terribly powerful book on the careless society, in which he makes the case that the worst thing that has happened in the United States since World War II is the building of the National Social Service Delivery System. Ouch. Some of you in this crowd either are or are becoming social workers and service providers. But McKnight's point is this. We are over-professionalizing care to the extent that we are robbing communities of their natural capacity to care. It becomes too easy across time for all of us to over-depend on the experts, when in fact so much of the expertise is actually grounded in human lives. It has just gone underground. I'll tell you one other thing that is interfering. One other thing that turns the people into a people who seek too much professional solutions, or who turns our citizens into people who think they have no power, responsibility, or accountability in the lives of kids. And it has to do with the dominance in the United States of the language of deficit reduction. That is, the dominant paradigm in America when thinking about kids is to examine their lives through a heat-seeking lens, one which is constantly focusing on problems to be reduced. Let me give you some examples about how this gets institutionalized. Think of the names of the federal agencies that support work having to do with raising healthier kids. You see anything common in these names? The Office of Substance Abuse Prevention, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office of Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Programs, the Center for Disease Control. The theme is that they are all about the issue of naming and articulating social problems to be reduced. See, all know real change is happening in the United States when there's a federal agency called something like the Center for Naming Kids in Neighborhoods. Kind of a silly name, I suspect, but you get my drift. You see, there is a disempowering nature in America to the American spirit across the last 30 or 40 years of framing so much of our work around the negative. The media doesn't help us. 2/3 of all of the stories that we consume in America via the media is about human mayhem. 2/3 of the stories are about disorder, things falling apart, people taking about danger in our communities. There have been 9 headline stories in Time and Newsweek since Columbine High School. National news magazines. Listen to these 9 titles and ask yourself, what do these do to the American spirit and the willingness to connect to our young? They go something like this: Portrait of the Killers, The Science of Teen Violence, The Monsters Next Door, The Secret Life of Teens, How to Spot a Troubled Child, Murder in the First Grade, The Killers Tell Us Why They Did It, Columbine a Year Later, Can You Spot a Killer Kid? Why isn't there a Time or Newsweek story on how to spot a caring kid, how to spot a healthy kid, how to spot a whole kid? It would enter the human imagination in an entirely different way. But America is so used to the heat-seeking lens, we can't seem to break out of deficit reduction language. I'm here, I guess, to really talk with you about the other side of the coin. One side being trying to reduce the problems and the risks that get in the way. Good stuff. Yes, we do want to focus on and reduce poverty, family abuse, neighborhood and school violence. Absolutely. But the other side of the coin is a different energy system. It is about building human strength in our young. And it takes a people to do that. It takes our communities to do that. It's a different imagination, a different lens, a different way of knowing, and a different way of being. So our work at Search Institute is actually now about reawakening among the residents of American communities a sense of their own capacity to matter deeply in the lives of children and adolescents, even if they're not mentors or volunteers. But that mattering is partly about how one carries oneself in the dailiness of life, about how one slows down and attends to the children and adolescents in our midst. Our work is also about reawakening all of our socializing systems, our faith communities, which now are very age-segregated, our schools that are chasing benchmark test scores for reasons far beyond them, to reawaken our neighborhoods that have closed their doors, to reawaken our employers to their power in community building. What we're trying to do is to build a shared vision in towns and cities about the capacity of all of us to be on the team to matter. By the way, the mantra for our work is, if you breathe in the United States, you are on the team. If you breathe, if you're going to build asset-rich kids, you are on the team. It doesn't matter whether you had kids, never had kids, have kids right now. You are on the team if, in fact, we are going to raise healthy and whole young people. So early in this decade, I began to build this alternative language system, a language system not of violence, chemical use, teen pregnancy, AIDS, poverty, family abuse, predator adults, but to build a language system about caring school, caring neighborhood, parent-child conversation, intergenerational community, being raised in a community that values kids, having useful roles to play, consistent expression of boundary across family, neighborhood, and school, adult role models, safe places to hang, engagement in art, music, drama, dance, bonded to school, doing homework, committed to honesty, integrity, social justice, equality, developing competencies to reduce conflict nonviolently, to know how to be an empathic human being, to know how to be a friend and make friends, to grow up in a way where one has a sense of personal efficacy, of personal power, that the future is worth living to get to, healthy self-concept. In some ways, my friends, it is not hard to name the building blocks. We did it scientifically. We named these 40 developmental building blocks by integrating vast quantities of social science literature. One of the books that a few of you know is cleverly titled Developmental Assets, a Synthesis of the Literature. It's actually a review of about 1,100 journal articles about positive building blocks of development that help boost health forward, help boost academic achievement forward, and help, when having them, to reduce many of the problems that we would love to reduce in this culture. 40 building blocks where we were careful to be sure that they were applicable across race, ethnicity, family income, geography, gender. In some sense, beginning to try to name a universal core of positive developmental building blocks. We put them in 8 categories: support, empowerment, boundaries and expectations, structured time use, lifelong learning commitment, human values, social competencies, positive identity. And within each of those categories, there are 5 or 6 of these developmental building blocks. We do the best we can to communicate to American citizens just the language of the 40. In fact, one of my craziest dreams is that a Manna and Frigidaire will start to print the developmental asset list on refrigerator doors. So that, because when human beings, see, look, I've been doing this a long time. I've got my own kids, and I'll tell you, every time I look at the developmental asset list I built, I learn something. I find just looking at the list causes me to pause about my moments of possibility. I've looked at that list 1,000 times, and every time it renews my energy and reminds me of my power and also helps me critique myself on the fact that I get too busy to slow down to be an asset-building human being in other people's lives. Because, you know, finally I recognize that all that really matters in my life is to be an asset builder. That's really what my life fully and totally ought to be about. It is the stuff that gives energy, gives power, gives meaning, connects me to others, builds community. It's the stuff of hope and possibility. But I'm a professional, so I'm out at Ball State today doing this. I'm going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania tomorrow, and I'll be in New York City doing this next week as New York gets ready to mobilize 7 million citizens around the asset framework. All of a sudden I realize I'm not attending to the young in my own midst. And so, see, it provides for me a very important critique and grounding place for what matters. And I'm not there yet either, for it is a culture that rewards other things more than it rewards being a builder of strength. But in your own life, you know that the stuff that really matters, the stuff that gives you power and sustenance, the stuff that gave you power and sustenance, is to be an asset-building human being. I put the 40 developmental assets earlier this decade into a measurement system so that communities could use the lens of these 40 developmental assets to take a different snapshot of the kids of a city. Because every city already knows what percentage of kids drink and drop out and fail school and get in trouble. Those rates are all over the place. But we were asking towns and cities to imagine using a different lens about how are we doing as a city in building these 40 developmental strengths. To date, about 1,100 cities have their portrait. About 200 cities a year enter this process of knowing and discovery, and it is a very different lens. But let me just tell you a couple things we discover when we assess the 40 developmental building blocks in the United States. First of all, we discover that the average middle school and high school student in the United States, the average or typical, doesn't have 35 of these 40 building blocks, or 30, or 25, or 20. But the average is 18.3. What that means, my friends, is that the typical developmental journey is to grow up asset depleted. The typical developmental journey. Boys average 3 assets less than girls. Boys average 16.5, girls about 19.5. Someday we need to talk together about how the irony occurs of a traditionally patriarchal society raising its males to be less healthy than its females when using this lens. It's a very interesting examination that we need to be a part of. The developmental assets are no stronger in towns of 1,000 and 2,000 people than in huge cities like Seattle and Portland. Seattle's average number of assets is as good as Black Duck, Minnesota, an idyllic little community up near the North Shore with 1,000 people. But Seattle's doing as well as Black Duck. The problem is most kids in Seattle and Black Duck are asset depleted. It's the typical developmental journey. The developmental assets are powerful. It's the most important part of the science of our work is to demonstrate to cities that as the developmental assets rise in number, as kids develop 25 or 30 or 35 of these building blocks, that as the assets rise in number, every public health problem a city worries about is significantly reduced. Tobacco rates go down, alcohol rates, illicit drug use rates, teen pregnancy, the rate actually of sexual intercourse during the adolescent years declines, anorexia and bulimia decline, antisocial behavior, violence, school dropout, gambling behavior all decline. And as the developmental assets rise in number, thriving outcomes move forward. The more developmental assets a young person has, the more likely they are to achieve in school, the more likely they are to choose to be a leader, the more likely they are to be engaged in caring for other people in community, the more likely they are to own their own body and to make decisions about their own body. The developmental assets then help to retard the problems and to enhance thriving. But the issue I'm putting out for you is the fact that the majority of young people in the United States now have fewer than half of these 40 developmental building blocks. In fact, 62% of America's kids, via our assessment, 62% of our kids in the middle school and high school years have 20 or fewer of the assets, and only 8% of our young people have more than 30. This, my friends, is a serious indictment of a society, of a culture, to be raising that many human beings who are asset depleted. You finally get to the question about, well, where does asset building power come from? Whose job is it to nurture these building blocks of support, affirmation, connection, belonging, structure, boundary, value transmission, competency building? Where does that happen? Schools ought to be 1/6 of the energy system for asset building, not 3/4. Families ought to pick up and do a significant piece. Congregations ought to do about 1/6. Little League coaches ought to be retrained to think about what it means to be an asset-building relational person in kids' lives. I'm not quite sure of exactly the formula of 1/6 and 1/4 and 1/8 and 3/4, but you get my drift. Asset building, this strength building, is a work of all the systems, of all the people within communities. One of the newest efforts we're doing in America is to think about the power of adolescents as asset builders, to not fall into the trap of treating adolescents as the recipients of asset building, but to become proactive in their own lives for asset building, and then to begin to use peer influence in order to build assets in peers. Wouldn't that be a revolutionary thing to pull off? It is in some sense peer helping writ large, but it is the transformation of what it means to be young in terms of one's own power to matter in the lives of kids. Of the adolescents in Muncie now, of those kids who are between 13 and 18, how many right now choose to exercise their asset building power with 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds in Muncie? My guess, it's pretty rare. And what a loss of power, because you know 16-year-olds are gods to 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds. It doesn't get any better than that. So why, when people are waiting for buses on street corners, do adolescents segregate over here, middle school students here, elementary students over here? Why is it that adolescents so rarely choose to be present and to exercise their power in the lives of emerging human beings? And if the choice is made, why is it so often a female who chooses it and so rarely a male? Friends, I'm talking now then about the need in this culture not only for adult transformation, but adolescent transformation, about who has the power, what matters, how strengths actually get built in the real world. Since 1995, 604 cities in the United States have begun asset building initiatives. The first was in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. In 1995, it's a suburb just west of Minneapolis. It then spread through some communities in Minnesota to La Crosse, Wisconsin, jumped up to Marquette, Michigan, and then I can't even remember what's happening. It has been a flurry of the spreading of a paradigm. And it spreads itself. That is, Search Institute is not the only place spreading the paradigm of building strengths. There are a lot of ambassadors for this work, a tremendous number and a growing number of asset champions. There are 30 cities in Connecticut now underway. Seattle, Portland, Albuquerque, Minneapolis are large cities with huge asset building initiatives. As I noted, New York City is gathering 500 civic leaders to begin to imagine how do you transform socializing systems, public places, individual relationships with kids in New York around this whole framework and paradigm of building these developmental building blocks. It's in small towns, it's in suburbs. I am really excited that the 5th annual Healthy Community, Healthy Youth Conference will be here in Indianapolis a year from November. It's been in Minneapolis or St. Paul 3 times, in Denver last year, but comes to Indiana next year, a year from November. And if you're there, what you will discover is 2,000 to 2,500 adolescents and adults from all over the United States teaching each other about how the asset building paradigm enters and gets utilized in probation systems, daycare centers, middle schools, high schools, youth ministry programs, 4-H, all the other youth-serving organizations, playgrounds, Parks and Rec, Burger Kings, Wendy's. It's so cool that in the state of Montana right now, the 20 Wendy's in that state give the list of 40 developmental assets to anybody who goes through the drive-through line, and a card we developed that lists 150 ways any human being can build assets in a kid's life. That's what Wendy's has decided to do in Montana. I don't know why they decided to do that. I love the fact that I'm no longer in control of this, probably never was. That the movement spreads. And see, what our work now as a scientific place is to learn with these hundreds of communities and thousands of organizations about how transformation occurs, how the light bulb goes on, how people use it strategically, how they use it practically, how they mobilize and teach, where they get stuck, where they get funding to support this work. So our work now is largely about field learning, an applied research organization building feedback loops with hundreds of cities and towns, and then convening everybody together in a national dialogue and conference to be co-learners and co-teachers. I wish I had more time to explore with you our models of asset building community, the energy we try to put out there about the nature of asset building community, how we tell the stories of asset building community. I don't have time to do that. It's wonderful to see back on the tables in the back a tremendous amount of literature that is put out here by our corporate partner, Lutheran Brotherhood, who nationally is stepping up to the plate to make resources about asset building available all across the United States. If you want, you can pick up some of the materials that have been fashioned about what happens when the asset building light bulb goes on. It's a work that now is entering state governments, a certain amount of federal policy. I was asked recently to help craft Colin Powell's speech at the Republican National Convention, though I'm not a Republican, but I did it because Colin Powell is such an important advocate for kids. But I was asked to provide some language that would help him position his conversation about kids higher than the Republican Party. And you might have heard, actually, in both the Democratic and Republican conventions, the mantra of something like all kids are our kids. That's in the ether now. It is the starting point. All kids are our kids. Kids don't belong to somebody else. All kids are our kids. My friends of Muncie and Ball State, this is a culture losing its way. Through a conspiracy of factors, the processes and dynamics of healthy human development are eroding before our very eyes. It is becoming the norm to segregate our cultural neophytes from the wisdom and experience of our elders, to treat children and adolescents as objects of community programs rather than as subjects within community, to give mixed signals or no signals at all about what matters, to ignore the young in public places or treat them with suspicion, to deny them meaningful roles in civic life, fill their heads with images of conflict and mayhem, fuel an early lust for possessions, tolerate or even encourage self-indulgence, raise them in neighborhoods where too few know their names, expect too little responsibility from them for the welfare of others, and then send them to underfunded, understaffed, and all too often inattentive schools, daycare centers, and after-school programs. And then we bemoan their fate while blaming their families, and in the case of the poor, holding family solely accountable. Developmental assets are in disrepair in all American communities, irrespective of family income or race. The crisis we face is general and widespread civic attention to the power of relationship. As Robert Bly cogently writes, we have to find and name that secret road that has led American society in such a brief time from being a moderately disciplined and moderately respectful culture to a culture in which 12-year-olds shoot each other and Calvin Klein uses children for sexually explicit advertisements. It is into this developmental vacuum, into this moment when too many of our young are untethered to community, untethered to tradition, that there streams a susceptibility to sensation-seeking, to instant gratification, a desperate search for belonging, an over-testing of limits. The way out of this developmental morass begins with a massive shift in public will, with a resurrection of collective and historical memory about the capacity and responsibility of all human beings to envelop the young in webs of support, attention, affirmation, and care. The developmental assets approximate this historical and universal memory. My friends of Indiana, this is a special city, a special university, place which historically has attended to its kids, but where there are now many pockets around the university and the community that are purposely embracing asset-building community as a paradigm, a philosophy to begin to build with and to grow with. Ball State University is on our radar screen in Minneapolis. It has been a pioneer in integrating the developmental asset framework into the training of a new generation of leaders, particularly of teachers, to deeply plant this script so far inside the soul and heart of new and emerging leaders that one will never forget one's power to matter in the lives of children and adolescents, and will use that power regardless of position or lot. And I applaud Ball State for taking leadership in how this integration into the curriculum occurs. Finally, you can so easily imagine, I'm sure, about what all of this means to the university within city, about the bridges between university and city, about the engagement of university in asset building city, the engagement of a university as convener and catalyst and teammate in becoming a city with the best developmental infrastructure human beings can build. We're talking, my friends, about capacity, hope, and possibility. Many of us desperately search for hope and possibility, and I can tell you that as we see more and more asset champions emerge, they find in this work something that touches their lives deeply and helps to fill an ache, a need to be connected, to belong, to be a part of the stream of life that informs and changes, builds, and holds up. As General Colin Powell has put it so succinctly, America, we can choose to build prisons, or we can choose to build kids. My friends, I stand on the side of building kids. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.